The two of us who were men were told that it would be good for us, and so we dutifully read it. But in this day before the internet, when I couldn't just quickly look for some sort of digital version of Cole's notes, I needed to read it, the whole thing. I skimmed through it very briskly, but found myself captivated by it. And so I returned to look at it again, to read it once more, even though I had just finished it, and to take careful notes, which I have used ever since in wedding ceremonies and memorial services, passages in worship services, and, well, sometimes just for personal reflection. And so when I decided on this morning's theme, I was working from my notes and didn't imagine that I would return to the book one more time to read it, to, well, immerse myself in its contents and appreciate what she had written 70 years ago. But I did. I have a confession, though. Before I was required to read this book in not quite theological school, it was before theological school even started. Although it was a reading requirement in the class, I had an existing allergy, a pre-existing condition, an allergy to Charles Lindbergh, who had a very sketchy history from the years leading up to the Second World War, part of the America First movement that existed back in those days. And so I wasn't sure that I wanted to read a book written by his beloved, even though it was a post-war volume. And ironically, this book, Gift from the Sea, did a lot to rehabilitate the Lindberghs' reputation, Charles Lindbergh included. And so when I sat down to read it again, it didn't occur to me until I was halfway through that I would have a new visceral dislike for Charles Lindbergh as I read it. Because in the years that have passed, it was revealed that Charles Lindbergh was a philanderer, that he had 3 different families in Europe, in addition to the family he had with Morrow Lindbergh. And while that's none of my business, it was very difficult to read the second half of the book without my mind going constantly back to that 21st century fact that was revealed. It was challenging because once more I found myself holding Charles Lindbergh in contempt as I realized that much of this volume is actually Morrow Lindbergh's hint about what was going on. I think she knew. And I think it explains a great deal of the second half of the book. And so I'm not going to focus on that half because I'm still processing it. But the book as a whole is a wonderful volume. It might be considered to be the volume that ushered in the modern voluntary simplicity movement, for that is a recurring theme in the volume. A Gift from the Sea is set naturally enough at the beach, which Morrow Lindbergh characterized as a place unfit for work, for the countless tasks that clutter our lives and weigh upon our spirits. When we arrive at the beach, we should leave our desks and workbenches, our kitchens and laundry rooms, our calendars and commutes behind us. Ideally, it's a place where we might even leave our thoughts behind us, at least at the beginning, and embrace the limits of the shoreline. In Lindbergh's case, the seashore, but I can't see why a lake shore or yonder riverbank wouldn't do as well. Immersed in the natural rhythms of the environment, we can let go of the mere busyness that so often vexes us in our daily rounds and relax, becoming part of our surroundings and letting life roll over us as effortlessly as the waves break upon the shore. It is in this state of relaxation that we may become open to the gifts that life offers without our even seeking them. Indeed, without any real effort at all, just faith and patience. Reflecting on a shell she discovered along the beach, which it turns out she was given along the beach, which was occupied first by a snail-like creature and then by a hermit crab, she noted that she considered the perfection of its architecture. Against this elegant perfection, she compared her own life, the shell of her existence, if you will, and found it full, but somehow wanting. I mean to lead a simple life, she confessed, to choose a simple shell I can carry easily, like a hermit crab. But I do not. I find that my frame of life does not foster simplicity. She went on to describe the life she had chosen as a caravan of complications, proceeding to list what seems like dozens of activities, demands, and expectations that dominated her daily existence, not to mention the countless individuals whose lives intersected with her own and placed additional demands upon her. It sounded a little like church to me. What a circus act we women perform every day of our lives, she observed. It does not bring grace. It destroys the soul. Simplicity has been displaced by multiplicity, she concluded, and distraction was already pervasive long before the advent of television and social media. And while she saw this as especially burdensome in mid-20th century America, she recognized that the problem could be seen in so-called civilized societies for centuries, even millennia. Indeed, even the ancient philosophers addressed its dangers in what we think of as much simpler times. Lindbergh identified the central question of life as this: how to remain whole in the midst of the distractions of life, how to remain balanced no matter how centrifugal forces tend to pull one off center, how to remain strong no matter what shocks come in at the periphery and tend to crack the hub of the wheel. Let's say that one more time. The central question in life was how to remain whole in the midst of the distractions of life, how to remain balanced no matter what centrifugal forces tend to pull one off center, how to remain strong no matter what shocks come in at the periphery and tend to crack the hub of the wheel. And she acknowledged that there are no easy answers, although there are hints at how we might respond. Simplicity does not necessarily lend itself to the simplistic. Lindbergh began with eliminating distractions, what we might now call decluttering, even downsizing. It helps to have an oversized life to begin with, I suppose, but the basic principle is scalable. Most of us have more than we need, and rather than serving our needs, this abundance may actually become burdensome to us. It often does. She compared the simplicity of her cottage by the sea, where she vacationed with her family, happy and content, with the distractions and demands of suburban living, not to mention the hypocrisy in human relationships she found in suburbs. The most exhausting thing in life, I have discovered, is being insincere, she lamented. That is why so much of social life is exhausting. One is wearing a mask. Acknowledging that simplicity might be enforced against one's will, as in the case of a prisoner or someone in holy orders. An interesting comparison in my mind. She contended that when we stumble into simplicity or choose it for ourselves, it brings serenity with it. Now, Gift from the Sea is written to women as an audience. But when I get to this point, when I did twice, nearly 40 years ago, and when I did earlier this month, it really resonates with me. And it helps me to better appreciate and to better understand why, when this service is over, and I've attended to a few meetings over the next couple of days, I am going to flee to my cottage at the lake to see if I too can come into contact with my inner simplicity. Hildegard, she has a name. Hildegard has been my haven now for 20 years, where Cindy and I go whenever we can, all year round, to find respite from the busyness of life in the city. It's somewhere where I can sit and write at the kitchen table rather than at a proper desk. It's somewhere where I can read at my leisure with few distractions. It's somewhere where we get to welcome the occasional visitor to our front deck or inside the door to the living room, but not the steady stream of people who might otherwise appear. And it is somewhere where we can find ourselves, if you will. It's a real luxury to have. It's not as cluttered as our house at home, our home in the city. And for that reason, for that very reason, I find it easier to calm myself down in that space. I love it, and I'm grateful for it. And I recognize the almost unthinkable privilege of having a home in the country where I can flee when I need to find myself. So did Morrow Lindbergh, on an island, no less, surrounded by the sea. But Lindbergh contended that simplifying our outer lives is not enough, but only a step towards simplifying our inner lives on the road to inner harmony. She then turned to islands in the book, islands of space, but also islands of time, essentially psychic islands, which she viewed with approval rather than with judgment. Although we often use islands as a metaphor for those who cut themselves off from society, Lindbergh had a far more positive view, seeing the island as self-contained, whole, and serene, which in a Thoreauvian sense respects the solitude of others rather than imposing society upon them. We are all, in the last analysis, alone, she maintained. We are solitary. We may delude ourselves and act as though this were not so. however much we may not want to think of ourselves as alone, which she characterized as wallflower panic. Instead, Lindbergh understood human beings as islands in a common sea, and she encouraged people to find time to be alone with themselves, without the countless distractions available to us in the modern world, to cherish the seawater that separates us as much as the shoreline that brings us together. In the book, she describes 2 nights and a day that she spent alone at her cottage. It's important to remember that she had 5 children at home, the youngest not yet 10, and how she savored the experience. Even in this welcome solitude, however, she felt closer to other people, for it is not physical solitude that actually separates us from other people, not physical isolation, but spiritual isolation. When one is a stranger to oneself, then one is estranged from others too. If one is out of touch with oneself, then one cannot touch others. Again, in terms of my own life, I thought of all the years where I thought I was being deprived, spending an evening alone in a hotel room, maybe a whole week of such evenings after working with congregations as I crisscrossed the continent. I felt deprived, and that was actually one of the things that brought me back home to work in this city, rather than to continue being on the road 100 days a year. And now, strangely enough, 10 years away from that work, I sometimes miss the solitude of a hotel room, or being alone in an unfamiliar park, in an unfamiliar city, and simply watching the wildlife around me, including the wildlife of other people's children. I now look back on those years, and instead of feeling like I lost something, instead of feeling like I had been a stranger in my own home city for so many years, I look back on the opportunities I really had to do nothing more than think. Quiet time alone, says Lindbergh, contemplation, prayer, music, a centering line of thought or reading, of study or work. It can be intellectual or artistic, any creative life proceeding from oneself. It need not be enormous or a great work, but it should be something of one's own. And then she went on to spend half of the book talking about relationships, about the strangers who smile at you on the beach, who come up and offer you a shell for no reason, which gets your book started, perhaps, and then go on to just leave you alone. And then she talks about other relationships, the ones that are long going, that become complicated over time, noting that it's important to make space in such relationships so that there is still time to be alone, alone with oneself and alone together. And of course, that got me thinking that there are reasons why my wife Cindy doesn't attend church here. And it's not because she doesn't love me, nor is it because she has issues with any of you. It's just not her thing. She's metaphorically off beachcombing with Morrow Lindbergh, and I respect this. I should have been reading this book every year of my marriage to better understand the person that I was married to. Because it turns out that my beloved is the very model of what it means to live gift from the sea. That's how she's been doing it all along. And I think by rereading it for the first time in nearly 4 decades, I fell in love with Cindy all over again. And I'm not as resentful as I could sometimes be that she didn't toddle along to church with me. I even better understand her protests whenever someone would describe her as a minister's wife, and she would respond by saying, I am married to a minister, but I am not a minister's wife. I understand it better now and appreciate it more deeply. At the beach, Lindbergh learned to stop collecting and moved on to selecting. She discarded the things that weighed her down and selected only things that were beautiful to her, life-giving, supportive of her quest for simplicity. And she came to realize that the way to find the grace of inner harmony is through the search for outward simplicity, for inner integrity, and for fuller relationship. When we start at the center of ourselves, she said, we discover something worthwhile, extending toward the periphery of the circle. We find again some of the joy in the now, some of the peace in the here, some of the love in me and thee, which go to make up the kingdom of heaven and earth. And so my parting wish at the end of this church year is that each of you may enjoy this summer finding your center, discovering something worthwhile about yourselves, and letting that extend out through the periphery of your life into the lives of others. I hope you discover joy in the now, some peace in the here, the inner harmony that will make your life more satisfying and enrich the world with your presence. Please join with the closing hymn, which I thought I had written on the next page.